Hello, my name is Brendan Hicks from the University of Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand, and today I'm going to give you a basic tour of how to create pivot tables in Excel 2010. Now, in my experience, pivot tables are one of the most useful tools that ecologists can use when they have aggregations of data and they want to create some simple tables out of them. And I turn to pivot tables first now, before I go to a statistical program for analysis. So looking at this data sheet, we have a column that identifies the site where these fish are caught. We have the species of fish: longfin eel, LF eel, koi carp, goldfish, common bully, and inanga. And then we have the length of each fish and the weight of each fish. And this is a rectangular data file. We can tell that because all columns are of equal length, and so all cells are filled. You don't have to have that for pivot tables, but it's a good place to start. Plus there's one single column header row, so we mustn't have more than one column header row. So the first thing we need to do is to identify the data range that we're going to use to the pivot table. And we do that by clicking on this cell, which is to the left of the A and above the 1, and that highlights the entire data sheet. Right, second thing that we need to do is to insert, so we go to the Insert tab, a pivot table. So here, if you hover over, you can see the pivot table, gives you a few instructions. Click there. Now you'll see that it's automatically selected the data range, which we've already highlighted, so that's good. We can just accept that default, and it's going to place it into a new worksheet. That's good too. So we can click OK, and then what we see is a portion here on the upper left where the data will aggregate, and then we have on the right we have some columns. So we have some data identifiers for the columns, which are useful. So an obvious thing to do with the site is to make it the rows of our table, and we'll make the species our columns. So to do that, we simply click on the site label and drag it to the row field. And then we see that the sites have appeared here as row headers in the data aggregation area. Next, we want to identify our species. We're going to use those as column headings, so click on it and then click and drag and place that into the columns. And then we see that our species have lined up where we expected them. Note we get this annoying little blank here, which we can get rid of easily. Let's do that later, but for the moment it's not a problem. Right, now you see we've got no data in our central field. So let's say eventually we want to get the sum of the weights of all these fish. So let's drag weight into the sum values. So sigma here, this capital sigma is a Greek letter, and this indicates numerically a sum. So that shows the sum of values. It's actually not quite what we get first out. So you'll see that now we've populated the pivot table with numbers. Now these don't actually look much like the sums of the weight, and when we hover above one of the numbers we see no, indeed they're not actually numbers, they're counts. But that's useful because this means we've counted the number of fish for each species by sight. So seeing as that is useful data, I'm going to copy that and save it, and I'll show you why in just a moment. But if we highlight the upper left hand cell, hold down the Shift key, this is important, put the cursor now hovering above the lower right hand, and that will identify all of the data. We can go to copy command, go to a new sheet and use the paste as values command, and then we see we've got our data now. Now it is values, it's not part of the pivot table anymore, so if we change the pivot table we won't be changing these data. That is quite useful. So about this time you might realise that we've got some unidentified sheets here, so it's quite useful to identify the sheets. So here, let's go double click and we'll identify this as tables. The next sheet, well, that's our raw data, so let's double click there and identify that as data. And there's our pivot table, what's labelled sheet 6. So pivot table, and now we know where our tables are, our data is. That makes it useful to kind of navigate between. So now you'll see that our fields here at the right have disappeared. That looks like a problem, but if we click anywhere in the pivot table, you'll see they reappear. So now we've got our coding columns back here on the right hand side. So, but now we know we've got count. Well, the right button on the mouse here is very useful. So if we click anywhere in the table and we right click now, so not left but right click, now we can summarize values by, and what you'll see when you hover over that summarize values by is the count is checked. So if we go to the field above, we can now click sum, and now we've got the sum of the biomass. So the numbers become very much larger because some of these fish are quite big and there are some reasonable sized catches at some of the fields. Again, this is the pivot table, so I like taking the data out. Again, highlight the upper left cell, hold down the shift key, highlight the lower right, and we've identified the whole data range we want to copy. This time I'll use Control Copy, Control C, and I'll go back to the tables, and I'll put my cursor where I want the table to appear, paste as values, and there I've got a data for mass of these fish. So I can go right ahead and label these, quite useful to do that as you go along. So this is number of fish at each site, and if I take the cursor along I can merge and center, get an underline, and I can do the same thing down here. This is biomass of fish at each site, and now I can give it a unit, grams, because it is in grams. Merge, center, underscore. Then we've got two tables. Now another thing that's happened here, we haven't got a consistent number of decimal points. I really hate that. So they should be consistent. So we highlight the data, we go to format, format cells, number, suppress all the decimal points by giving it 0 decimal places. Okay, we've got some data that look alright. Actually, while we're about that, another useful thing, doing that again, format cells, is to use the comma separator. Okay, so now we have all the values in grams, comma separator, no stray decimal points, and another useful thing is just to sort of tidy those up. And at this point, we can get rid of those troublesome blank rows by highlighting at the top on the J there, delete, and we can highlight row 23, also a blank, delete, and we can delete. So grand total, pretty meaningless, a total is a total. There, and there, and we can put some nice borders there. So now we basically have made a publication quality table, or a couple of them in fact, just from a few minutes work once the data have been entered and we've got them in the right file form to use as a pivot table. Remember, key points here are we need a rectangular data file, number of columns, encoding columns, and some data columns, and they're all the same length, which makes a rectangular data file, and we've got our completed tables now. We can just expand that a bit so we can see all of the species names. Alright, thank you very much. I hope this was useful for you.